Snow clung to the cliffs of Marche-les-Dames. At the base lay a motionless figure, his temple dark with frozen blood. This was Albert I of Belgium. The king who had survived the shells of World War I walked the trenches with his soldiers, yet met his end alone on a mountainside. Accident or a hidden hand? And why, on that winter day, was the king there with no guard, no witness? In this video, we'll follow the trail of snow, blood, and sealed archives to ask the question: did the king slip? Or was the truth buried with him? Albert Leopold Clément Marie Meinrad was not born in the blinding spotlight of destiny. In fact, for much of his early life, he stood in the long shadow of others. An unassuming boy in a royal family whose line of succession seemed settled far above his head. Born on April 8, 1875 in Brussels, he was the second son of Prince Philippe, Count of Flanders, and Princess Marie of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. His older brother, Prince Baudouin, was the one groomed for the throne, the focus of courtly tutors and dynastic expectation. Albert, by contrast, moved quietly through the gilded halls, a prince more likely to be found with a book or wandering the gardens than posing for formal portraits. Those who knew him as a boy spoke of a certain reserve, a shyness that could easily be mistaken for timidity, but which, over time, revealed itself as thoughtfulness. His mother's influence ran deep. Princess Marie, a woman of German noble birth, had been raised with a mix of military discipline and Catholic devotion. But she also possessed a warmth rare in the stiff etiquette of 19th century courts. She encouraged her children to read widely, to take long walks, and to look servants in the eye when they spoke. For Albert, her example became the quiet foundation of his character, a belief that dignity was not measured in ceremony, but in how one treated those with no power at all. While other royal children were paraded through formal receptions, Albert's early days were often spent in the countryside. He developed a fascination with nature. The changing seasons, the texture of river stones, the scent of pine after rain. Horses became a passion, not as showpieces for royal processions. But as living creatures, he cared for himself. He would muck out stables, ignoring the protests of attendants who insisted it was beneath his station. This stubborn humility was already setting him apart from the typical mold of European princes, many of whom were groomed to keep their hands spotless and their distance intact. Albert's schooling reflected the dual worlds he inhabited. On one hand, he received the rigorous education expected of a royal: languages, history, law, and military science. On the other, his parents ensured he was exposed to practical skills. He learned to repair his own riding gear, to camp outdoors, to navigate by stars. In a time when monarchies were increasingly criticized as archaic and ornamental, these grounded abilities gave him an unusual credibility among ordinary Belgians, though most would not yet know his name. Tragedy, as it so often does in royal history, shifted the trajectory of his life. In 1891, Prince Baudouin died suddenly of pneumonia at the age of 21. The loss shook the family to its core, but for Albert, it was a double blow. Grief for his brother, and the abrupt realization that the weight of succession had just fallen onto his shoulders. Courtiers who had barely taken notice of him began assessing his posture, his command of languages, his grasp of politics. Every misstep was noted. Every opinion, however mild, began to matter. In those early years as heir presumptive, Albert's personality did not harden into the aloof formality that might have been expected. Instead, he carried with him the habits and instincts of the quieter boy he had been. When visiting factories, he spoke directly to workers and asked about their families. He rode his bicycle through Brussels without an entourage, startling pedestrians who realized too late they had just greeted the future king. The Belgian public, weary of the excesses and scandals associated with the reign of King Leopold II, found in Albert a refreshing figure, unpretentious, approachable, and seemingly untouched by the arrogance of court life. Behind palace walls, however, not everyone approved. The aristocracy worried that his informality would diminish the mystique of the crown. Some ministers muttered that his German maternal lineage might complicate diplomatic ties, especially in an age of rising nationalism. But Albert seemed less concerned with these whispers than with preparing himself for the role he had never expected to hold. He trained with the military, learning not only command structures, but the daily routines of soldiers. He traveled extensively within Belgium's provinces, seeking to understand the needs of farmers, dock workers, and miners. These were not symbolic visits. He took notes, asked practical questions, and followed up months later. An attention to detail that earned both respect and suspicion in equal measure. His marriage in 1900 to Elizabeth of Bavaria further shaped his public image. The daughter of Duke Karl Theodore, Elizabeth brought with her a reputation for intelligence, cultural sophistication, and strong humanitarian instincts. Together, they formed a partnership that was unusually visible for the time, with the couple often appearing side by side at charitable events and cultural gatherings. Where other royal marriages had been purely strategic, theirs showed genuine warmth, and that authenticity resonated with the Belgian people. By the first decade of the 20th century, Albert had become a figure of quiet stability in a rapidly changing Europe. Industrialization was transforming cities. Social movements were demanding reforms, and the clouds of political tension were beginning to gather on the horizon. Belgium, a small but strategically vital nation, sat between the ambitions of larger powers. Though Albert was not yet king, he was already thinking like one, considering how to balance modernization with tradition, and how to preserve the independence of a country often caught in the path of stronger neighbors. And then, in December 1909, the inevitable arrived. King Leopold II, infamous for his personal enrichment from the brutal exploitation of the Congo Free State, died after a reign mired in controversy. To many Belgians, his passing was not a cause for national mourning so much as cautious optimism. The crown now passed to Albert, a man of unassuming beginnings, of proven empathy, and of a character that promised a different kind of kingship. In that moment, the boy who had once seemed destined for a life in the background stepped forward into history. He was not the king anyone had planned for, but he was, perhaps, the king Belgium needed. And as he took the oath before Parliament, his steady voice carried a promise that would define the early years of his reign. To serve not only the crown, but the people. It was a promise he would keep, in peace, in war, and ultimately, until the day his body was found at the foot of a cold, silent cliff. When Albert took the oath of office on December 23, 1909, the chamber of Parliament was filled with more than the scent of polished wood and winter wool coats. It was thick with anticipation. The memory of Leopold II's long, controversial reign still clung to the air like smoke. Belgium was ready for something new, though what that new would look like was far from certain. Albert, just 34 years old, stood before the assembled deputies and senators in a dark mourning coat, his expression calm but unsmiling. His voice carried clearly through the hall, a pledge to govern in the spirit of the Constitution and to place the needs of the people at the forefront of his reign. It was a tone unlike the grandiose declarations of his predecessor. There were no self-congratulations, no rhetorical flourishes about royal glory. just a measured, deliberate promise. From the beginning, Albert seemed almost allergic to the excesses of monarchy. He trimmed the ceremonial retinue, pared down palace expenditures, and refused to indulge in the theatrical pomp that European courts often used to project authority. He walked unaccompanied through the streets of Brussels, visited marketplaces without a phalanx of guards, and made unannounced calls at schools and hospitals. These gestures, modest though they were, sent ripples through the Belgian public. Newspapers began referring to him as the People's King, a title that stuck throughout his reign. Yet Albert's reluctance for grandeur was not weakness. It was principle. He had little interest in ruling from behind a fortress of formality. He believed that a monarch's legitimacy rested not on distance, but on connection. In his view, if the people could not imagine speaking to their king, then the crown itself risked irrelevance. This approach, however, did not sit easily with everyone. Members of the old guard, still loyal to the memory of Leopold II, feared that Albert's informality eroded the mystique of the throne. In their eyes, ceremony was not just tradition. It was a barrier that kept monarchy above the messy squabbles of politics and the volatile tides of public opinion. Albert countered by pointing out that Belgium was a constitutional monarchy, not a medieval court, and that modern governance demanded transparency. His insistence on attending parliamentary debates in person rather than sending representatives was both admired and criticized. Admirers called it accountability. Detractors called it meddling. Early in his reign, Albert began to confront the deep political fissures that ran through Belgium. The nation was divided not only between Flemish and French-speaking communities, but also along lines of class, religion, and ideology. Industrial workers in cities like Liège and Charleroi were pushing for labor reforms, while rural conservatives resisted the erosion of traditional hierarchies. The king walked a delicate line, advocating for social progress while avoiding the perception of partisanship. One of his first significant acts was to quietly support the extension of voting rights. At the time, Belgium's electoral system was weighted heavily toward property owners and the educated elite. While Albert did not publicly campaign for universal suffrage, doing so would have been politically explosive. He signaled his approval for gradual reforms. By the 1920s, his influence would help steer Belgium toward a broader, more representative democracy. His marriage to Queen Elizabeth further reinforced his image as a modern monarch. Together, they championed the arts, science, and public health. Elizabeth's background as a trained nurse and her love for music brought a touch of humanity to the palace. The couple opened royal residences for charity events and lent their patronage to cultural institutions. Their visible partnership stood in stark contrast to the distant, sometimes scandal-ridden personal life of Leopold II, and it gave the monarchy a renewed moral credibility. Despite this popularity, Albert was never entirely comfortable with the trappings of kingship. He preferred working in his study to hosting state banquets, and he often escaped into the countryside to hike or climb. These absences were not derelictions of duty. He remained engaged in state affairs, but they were a reminder that he valued solitude and physical challenge over the endless choreography of court life. Privately, Albert was aware of his own limitations. Friends recalled that he spoke candidly about the weight of responsibility, admitting that he had not sought the crown and did not always relish its demands. Yet he also recognized that his role gave him a unique opportunity to shape the nation's character. "I must be," he once said, "a symbol that unites rather than divides." By the eve of the First World War, that philosophy had become the backbone of his reign. His reputation as a reluctant king had evolved into something more complex. A monarch who understood the power of restraint, who believed that credibility came not from how loudly one ruled, but from how steadily one served. Belgium, however, was about to face a test far greater than political division or social reform. In 1914, the German Empire's armies would cross its borders, and Albert, who had spent his life avoiding the grand theater of power, would find himself thrust into the center of a stage he could not leave. His crown, his people, and his very life would hang in the balance. The reluctant king would have no choice but to become a wartime leader, and in doing so, he would cement his place in the nation's memory, not through opulence or decree, but through courage in the mud and blood of the front lines. When war came to Belgium in August 1914, it arrived like a sudden storm over calm water, darkening the skies without warning and leaving no path of retreat. The German Empire, executing its Schlieffen plan to sweep through neutral Belgium and into France, delivered an ultimatum: allow their armies safe passage or face invasion. For most European monarchs, this would have been the moment to evacuate, to preserve the head of state in exile while diplomats and generals fought on their behalf. Albert I did the opposite. On August 2nd, he stood before Parliament, his voice steady but urgent, announcing Belgium's refusal to yield. Neutrality was not a scrap of paper, he insisted. It was the lifeline of the nation. And to surrender it would be to surrender the country's soul. A country which defends itself commands the respect of all, he declared. It was a simple sentence. But in that instant, Albert became not just the king of Belgium, but its living embodiment. The German armies crossed the border the next day. Within weeks, most of Belgium's territory had fallen. Brussels was occupied. Antwerp was under siege. The royal family could have fled to safety in Britain, but Albert moved his headquarters to the last unoccupied corner of the country, a narrow strip of land along the Isère River in West Flanders. There, in the flooded trenches and muddy fields, he remained for the next 4 years. It was here that the world's image of Albert was forged, not in the marbled halls of Brussels, but in the cold, wet monotony of the front. He refused to stay in comfort far behind the lines. Instead, he walked the duckboards with his soldiers, spoke to stretcher bearers, and listened to the gripes of men living ankle-deep in mud. He shared their rations, their cold, their fatigue. Letters from soldiers home described him as the tall figure in the simple uniform, a king without diamonds or gold braid, mud on his boots, the brim of his cap pulled low against the rain. The conditions were appalling. Shell fire was constant. The air reeked of cordite, stagnant water, and the unburied dead. Rats thrived, feeding on scraps and corpses alike. Disease, trench foot, dysentery, influenza, claimed nearly as many men as enemy bullets. Yet Albert insisted on being present, on seeing for himself what his army endured. It was not bravado, it was loyalty. In an age when monarchs often remained symbolic figures, Albert chose to be a working commander, reviewing troop positions, approving defensive plans, and even riding into exposed areas to inspect the lines. His leadership style was quiet but firm. He did not roar orders. He discussed them. He sought advice from his generals, but made the final decisions himself. When disagreements arose with the French and British high commands, both eager for Belgium to launch offensives that could have cost thousands of lives, Albert stood his ground, insisting that his army would fight on its own terms, defending Belgian soil rather than sacrificing his men for foreign objectives. This resistance earned him both criticism and respect. Some Allied officers muttered that he was too cautious, too unwilling to commit his forces to large-scale assaults. But among his soldiers, that caution was proof that their king valued their lives over prestige. They called him the Night King, a title that evoked medieval chivalry but reflected a thoroughly modern sense of responsibility. The Queen was never far from the front. Elizabeth, trained as a nurse, worked tirelessly in field hospitals, tending to the wounded and comforting the dying. Her presence reinforced the image of the royal family as part of the war effort, sharing its hardships rather than observing from afar. The couple's 3 children, including the young heir Leopold, lived near the front for much of the war, their upbringing shaped by the constant thud of artillery and the scarcity of peacetime comforts. Life on the Yser was a grind of endurance. Months blurred into years. Soldiers and civilians alike clung to hope in the form of small rituals. Hot coffee from mobile kitchens, concerts given by regimental bands, brief visits home for those lucky enough to be granted leave. For Albert, the ritual was the daily inspection. A walk along the parapets, a few words with the men, a handshake, a nod. It was a reminder that they were seen, that their king knew their names, their faces, their sacrifices. By 1917, with the United States entering the war and the tide slowly turning against Germany, the Belgian army began preparing for the long-awaited liberation. Albert played a key role in coordinating the final offensive in the autumn of 1918, leading Belgian forces in a series of advances that pushed the enemy back toward the border. When the armistice was signed on November 11th, Belgium had reclaimed its territory, battered but unbroken. Albert's return to Brussels was not a triumphant parade of self-congratulation. He entered the capital on horseback, flanked by soldiers, the streets lined with cheering citizens. But his speeches were modest, focusing on gratitude for the courage of the army, the resilience of the civilians, and the sacrifices of the Allied nations. He made no claim to personal glory. In his mind, the victory belonged to Belgium, not to him. The war had transformed him. The reserved, reluctant monarch who had ascended the throne in 1909 was now a national hero. Yet the years in the trenches had also taken their toll. The strain of command, the constant exposure to danger, and the weight of responsibility left him with a deep, private fatigue. As Europe entered the uneasy peace of the 1920s, Albert returned to the palace not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen too much of what war costs, and who knew that peace could be just as fragile. It was in those post-war years, away from the mud and noise of battle, that the isolation began to creep in. The crown, once a unifying symbol, would become a source of tension. And for the king who had stood among his soldiers, the quiet of peacetime would prove a different kind of battlefield. The armistice of 1918 did not bring Albert I the peace he had imagined, and it brought applause, medals, and ceremonial welcomes across Europe. But those public displays faded quickly. What remained was the return to a palace that felt colder than the trenches had ever been. At first, the post-war years were buoyed by optimism. Belgium had survived, reclaimed its territory, and even secured reparations from Germany. Albert was celebrated as the Soldier King, a monarch who had refused to abandon his post. His portrait hung in schools, civic buildings, and veterans' halls. Streets and squares were renamed in his honor. But the war had changed Belgium as much as it had changed Albert. The old political order was cracking. In 1919, under pressure from social movements and with Albert's support, Belgium introduced universal male suffrage. It was a significant reform, but one that shifted the balance of power away from the aristocracy and toward a broader, more unpredictable electorate. In the gilded salons of Brussels, whispers began. Some nobles accused the king of opening the door to instability, of pandering to the masses. Albert did not retreat from his position. His wartime experience had convinced him that the survival of the monarchy depended on aligning it with the people, not insulating it behind tradition. Yet in taking this stand, he found himself increasingly at odds with some of his own ministers, who still viewed the throne as an untouchable pillar of privilege. The political divisions in post-war Belgium were sharp. The Flemish movement, emboldened by wartime promises of cultural recognition, demanded equal status for the Dutch language. French-speaking elites resisted, fearing a loss of influence. Labor unions pushed for better wages and working conditions, staging strikes that brought parts of the country to a standstill. Each dispute, no matter how minor, seemed to land at the king's feet. Everyone wanted the soldier king to take their side, and no one was satisfied when he refused. Inside the palace, the war hero's image was wearing thin. Albert's distaste for ceremony, which had once charmed the public, now frustrated courtiers. He continued to limit state banquets, to appear in public without the layers of ritual his predecessors had favored, to spend long stretches away from Brussels on private retreats. Ministers sometimes waited days for an audience, only to find the king had gone hiking in the Ardennes or climbing in the Alps. To Albert, these solitary escapes were not neglect. They were necessity. The war had left him restless in enclosed spaces. Nature, with its silence and scale, was his antidote to the suffocating formality of court life. But to those who measured a king's value in hours spent in the throne room, his absences were a dereliction. Even within his family, the demands of the crown were isolating. Queen Elizabeth shared his love of the arts and his humanitarian values, but she was more at ease in social settings, more willing to navigate the endless obligations of diplomacy. Their children were growing into their own roles, particularly Crown Prince Leopold, who was beginning military training. Albert, who had raised them to value service over privilege, worried privately about what kind of Belgium they would inherit, and whether it would still be a monarchy at all. By the late 1920s, the post-war glow had faded entirely. The Great Depression rippled across Europe, striking Belgian industry hard. Unemployment soared. Political extremism, both fascist and communist, found fertile ground among the disillusioned. Once again, the king was called upon to embody stability, but the task was harder now. This was not the clear-cut defense of a nation under invasion. It was the slow erosion of confidence from within. Albert's position was further complicated by his insistence on remaining above partisan politics. While he met privately with leaders from across the spectrum, he avoided public endorsements, even when doing so might have shored up support for the monarchy. To some, this neutrality was admirable. To others, it was indecision. The very qualities that had made him a unifying figure during the war, restraint, caution, and aversion to spectacle, now made him seem distant. The isolation was not just political. Friends noticed he had grown quieter, more introspective, his dry humor surfacing less often. He spoke rarely of the war, except when pressed, and even then his accounts were sparse, as if revisiting those years cost him more than he wished to admit. When conversation turned to court intrigue, he would often excuse himself, preferring to read, walk, or plan his next climbing expedition. Those expeditions were more than a hobby. For Albert, mountaineering offered a purity he found nowhere else. The clarity of a goal, the tangible measure of progress, the necessity of trust in one's own strength and judgment. On the rock face, there were no political factions, no ceremonial scripts, only the ascent. But this passion, too, would set him apart from the expectations of a king. In an era when monarchs were symbols first and individuals second, Albert's personal pursuits were seen by some as indulgent, even reckless. By 1934, the gap between the public myth of the soldier king and the private reality of a man increasingly alone had widened beyond repair. His reign had begun with surprise, triumphed in war, and navigated the turbulence of reform. Yet, as he stood on the threshold of his 59th year, Albert I was, in many ways, as solitary as the quiet boy who had once been the second son with no expectation of a crown. Soon, that solitude would take him to a rocky cliffside on a winter's day, far from the capital, far from the court, far from anyone who could say for certain what happened next. For Albert I, mountaineering was never a diversion. It was a discipline. It demanded focus, humility before nature, and a willingness to face danger without pretense. Those who had accompanied him on climbs recalled that he moved with deliberate precision, speaking little, taking in the landscape as if committing it to memory. He disliked being fussed over, often carrying his own pack, insisting on setting his own ropes. In those moments on the rock face, the crown might as well have been a pebble in his pocket, present but irrelevant. Belgium knew their king as the soldier king, but among a smaller circle of friends and guides, he was simply Albert, a climber who loved the challenge of vertical stone and the solitude of the high places. He climbed in the Alps, the Dolomites, and the Ardennes, often seeking routes that tested both his skill and his nerve. In his private journals, he described the feeling of the wind on the cliff, the grain of the rock under his hands, the way each ascent required him to be fully alive in the present moment. It was a passion that worried some in his court. Monarchs were supposed to be careful with their bodies. Accidents could throw the nation into crisis. But Albert dismissed such concerns. A life without risk, he once said to a friend, was not life at all. He had survived 4 years of trench warfare, artillery fire, and the constant threat of assassination. How could he fear the mountains, which asked only for respect and skill? One place drew him back again and again. The cliffs of Marche-les-Dames, a dramatic limestone escarpment near Namur. Here, sheer rock walls rose from the Meuse River valley, riddled with ledges, cracks, and overhangs. It was a place of beauty and danger, beloved by climbers for its technical challenges. Albert knew these cliffs well. He had climbed them in summer warmth and winter frost, sometimes alone, sometimes with companions. On February 17, 1934, the king was in Brussels, carrying out his usual duties. The day was cold, the sky overcast, and the ground still slick with patches of snow and ice from earlier storms. At some point in the late afternoon, he made an unannounced decision to leave the capital and head for Marche-les-Dames. He told no ministers, left no formal note in the court schedule. Whether he intended a full climb or simply a solitary walk among the cliffs, no one could say for certain. He traveled with minimal gear, too minimal, some would later argue. There was no large climbing party, no official escort, no elaborate safety equipment. This was how Albert preferred it. Stripped down, personal, free of the ceremonial trappings that followed him everywhere else. To those who had served him long, this habit was familiar. He valued moments when the air was empty of protocol, when each step was his own. By the time he reached the cliffs, the winter light was already fading. The air was sharp with the scent of frozen earth and the faint metallic tang of the river below. Snow clung to the limestone, turning familiar holds slick and uncertain. In the forested slopes leading to the base, bare branches clattered together in the wind like bones. Some later speculated that Albert had been restless that day, burdened by political tensions and the constant friction of court life. Others believed he simply saw a rare opportunity for solitude and seized it. Whatever his reasons, he moved into the landscape he loved, a king stepping into the role of a lone climber. What happened over the next hours is a matter of conjecture. The official record is silent. There were no witnesses, no companions to recount the climb. We know only the outcome. Sometime before night fell, Albert I of Belgium fell from the cliffs of Marche-les-Dames. The official version was straightforward: a tragic climbing accident. The king had lost his grip or his footing on the icy rock. Striking his head in the fall, he died instantly. But from the very beginning, details didn't fit neatly together. There was no safety rope found on his body. His gloves, which might have provided grip, were not mentioned in the official inventory. Some accounts claimed the position of his body at the base of the cliff was inconsistent with a fall from above. When his absence from Brussels was noticed that evening, it caused immediate concern. A search party was dispatched, and in the gathering dark, the king's body was discovered lying on the snow at the base of the cliff. His head wound was severe, the blood already frozen into a dark crust against the pale ground. By the time his remains were transported back to the palace, the news was moving through Belgium with the speed of rumor. To the public, the idea that their king had died alone on a mountain seemed almost inconceivable. This was the man who had faced artillery fire without flinching, who had walked the front lines without armor. How could the cold indifference of a cliff claim him? At court, the shock was profound, but quickly contained. An official communiqué was prepared. The king had suffered a fatal accident while climbing. No further details were provided. The machinery of state moved to prepare for a royal funeral. Behind closed doors, however, unease lingered. Was this truly an accident? Or had something more deliberate unfolded on that cliffside? For those who knew him best, the day's events were not entirely surprising. Albert had always sought out solitude, sometimes to the frustration of his ministers. He had always tested himself against nature, sometimes recklessly. And yet, the abruptness of it, the speed with which an entire life could narrow to one fatal moment, was a reminder of the fine line between passion and peril. In the days to come, the official story would be repeated in newspapers and public statements. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. And in the minds of many Belgians, the last passion of their king had left behind not just grief, but a question mark that no official proclamation could erase. The morning after the fall, the cliffs of Marche-les-Dames lay silent under a thin veil of mist. Snow clung to the jagged rock, as if trying to hide the violence that had taken place the night before. But at the base of one sheer wall, the silence was broken, not by wind or river, but by the hushed voices of men who had found their king. Albert lay on his back, his body partially twisted, one arm bent unnaturally beneath him. His cap was gone, his hair, dusted with frost, was matted dark where the blood had frozen at his temple. The wound was deep, a jagged fracture that had ended his life instantly, or so the official report would later claim. His eyes were closed, his face eerily calm, as though sleep had overtaken him before pain could. But the stillness was deceptive. Around him, the snow bore signs of struggle. A shallow trail where his body had slid, impressions where boots had struck or slipped. The scattered debris of a pack that may or may not have been his. The men who found him were not guards or ministers. They were local climbers and gendarmes, called in when word spread that the king was missing from Brussels and had last been seen driving toward Namur. They covered his body with a heavy canvas sheet before carrying him down the slope, each step deliberate on the icy ground. One of them, a veteran who had seen death in the trenches, later told a friend that it was not the sight of the wound that stayed with him, but the way the snow beneath the king had turned the color of rusted iron. By the time the body reached the road, an official motor car was waiting. Orders had already been issued from the palace. Bring him back quickly, avoid public attention, speak to no one about the condition in which he was found. The gendarmes obeyed, but rumors began to move faster than any vehicle. In Namur, word of the king's death spread in whispers first, then in open conversation in cafes and markets. Some said he had fallen while climbing. Others insisted he had been shot, and the fall was a cover. A few swore they had seen strange lights or heard voices on the cliffs the night before. None of these accounts would be confirmed, but they flourished in the vacuum left by official silence. When the body arrived at the palace in Brussels, it was met by a cordon of guards and palace physicians. They examined him briefly, recorded the head injury, and concluded the cause of death as fracture of the skull due to accidental fall. No public inquest was held. No photographs were released. The climbing gear he had allegedly carried, if it existed, was never displayed. Within hours, the royal court issued a formal communiqué. His Majesty King Albert I, in the exercise of his beloved pastime of mountaineering, has suffered a tragic accident at Marche-les-Dames. The nation mourns a sovereign who gave his life in service and honor. It was a statement designed to end speculation. Instead, it fueled it. The choice of words, beloved pastime, tragic accident, felt too neat, too polished. There were no details about the climb itself, the route he had taken, or whether anyone had seen him ascend. In the days that followed, the press struggled to balance mourning with curiosity. Officially, papers ran somber front-page portraits of the late king, draped in black borders, accompanied by carefully edited biographies of his reign. Unofficially, journalists exchanged notes about inconsistencies, the lack of rope burns on his hands, the absence of chalk or dust on his clothing, the peculiar position of the body. Belgium was no stranger to political intrigue, and the interwar years had left the nation's politics fragile. For some, the possibility of foul play was unthinkable, a betrayal of a man who had stood for the country in its darkest hour. For others, it was entirely plausible. Albert had made enemies in high places. Conservative nobles who resented his reforms, foreign interests unsettled by his independence, even factions within the military unhappy with his post-war policies. Adding to the mystery was the choice of day. February 17th was not an ideal time for climbing. Daylight hours were short, the cliffs icy, and the weather unpredictable. Why would an experienced mountaineer like Albert take such a risk alone, without notifying anyone, without proper gear? Supporters of the accident theory argued that his familiarity with the site bred overconfidence. Skeptics countered that it was precisely because he knew the dangers so well that he would never have attempted it under such conditions. The palace maintained its silence. The funeral arrangements were announced swiftly, and the focus was redirected toward national mourning. Citizens were encouraged to remember the king's service during the Great War, his dedication to the people, his humility. There was no appetite, at least officially, for an inquiry that might tarnish that image. Yet in the cafes of Brussels, in the barracks of old soldiers, in the quiet corners of rural villages, the questions lingered. Some whispered that the king had been meeting someone at the cliffs, an informant, a confidant, perhaps even a lover, and that the meeting had ended in violence. Others believed he had discovered something politically dangerous, something worth silencing. No evidence surfaced to support any of these theories, but absence of evidence is a poor deterrent to rumor, especially when the subject is a man whose life and death had touched the entire nation. The image of Albert's body in the snow, carried away under a canvas sheet, became a private picture in the minds of Belgians, half real, half imagined, but impossible to forget. In the official record, it remained a tragedy without scandal. The final chapter of a king who had lived simply, ruled honorably, and died pursuing the freedom he cherished. In the unofficial memory, it was a cliffhanger that history had never resolved. A white expanse of snow, a dark stain spreading across it, and the uneasy knowledge that the truth might have been buried along with the man. The news had broken before dawn, yet by the time the sun rose over Brussels, the streets were already heavy with people. They came in silence. Men in worn overcoats, women clutching black scarves, children clinging to their parents' hands. Flags hung at half-mast, their colors muted in the winter light, and the air carried the low tolling of church bells that seemed to beat in unison with the slow, stunned hearts of the nation. The body of Albert I, draped in the Belgian flag, lay in state in the royal palace. Guards in ceremonial uniforms flanked the casket, their sabers drawn but unmoving, the polished steel reflecting the dim candlelight. The scent of wax and fresh wreaths filled the hall, mixing with the faint trace of cold air that followed every new arrival. A steady stream of citizens passed by, miners from Liège, farmers from Flanders, war veterans wearing faded medals on their chests. Some bowed. Others simply stood for a moment, eyes fixed on the still form of the man they had called the Night King, Night King. For the generation who had survived the Great War, Albert was not a distant monarch, but a living presence in their darkest hours. They remembered him walking the mud-choked trenches, refusing to abandon the front lines, his boots caked in the same dirt as their own. They remembered his speeches, calm, unwavering, when the German advance seemed unstoppable. Now those memories pressed against the silence of the funeral hall, each mourner carrying a private piece of the man who lay before them. The ceremony itself was an intricate blend of state protocol and personal grief. Inside the cathedral, shafts of pale light pierced the tall windows, illuminating the banners of Belgium's provinces hung in solemn order. The organ's deep notes rolled through the vaulted ceiling as dignitaries arrived. Ministers in dark coats, foreign envoys with solemn faces, royals from neighboring countries who had fought beside him or against him in the war. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floor as they took their places, the murmur of whispered condolences fading to nothing when the bells began again. Queen Elizabeth, veiled in black, stood near the casket. Her gloved hands were clasped tightly, the knuckles hidden but tense beneath the silk. She had been a partner in both the public life and private solitude of Albert's reign. A queen who had walked into field hospitals during the war, who had stood beside him in diplomatic battles after. Now, she bore the weight of a widow's loss under the eyes of the entire nation. Their 3 children stood near her. Prince Leopold, the new king, his face pale but composed. Prince Charles, looking down at the floor, and Princess Marie-José, barely holding back tears. As the Archbishop began the Requiem Mass, the Latin words rose and fell like a tide, washing over the assembly. Outside, the crowd stretched for blocks, unable to enter, but unwilling to leave. Vendors abandoned their stalls, trams stood empty on their tracks, and shopkeepers locked their doors. In a country still recovering from the wounds of war and political division, this day brought an unspoken unity. The king was gone, and for a moment, every difference faded beneath the same banner of mourning. When the final blessing was given, pallbearers in white gloves lifted the casket onto their shoulders. The weight was not only physical, it was the burden of carrying a man who had embodied the nation's endurance. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Brussels, past the silent crowds, past soldiers standing at rigid attention, past children perched on their father's shoulders for one fleeting glimpse. The rhythmic sound of boots on cobblestone, the low roll of drums, and the wail of brass instruments in the funeral march created a kind of heartbeat for the city. At certain points, flowers rained down from windows above. Handfuls of white chrysanthemums, symbols of mourning, drifting onto the casket like snow. Some fell onto the soldiers' uniforms. Others were crushed underfoot, their fragrance mingling with the cold air. The final destination was Laeken Cemetery, where generations of Belgium's royal family were entombed. The gates were opened wide, and the cortege entered in slow, deliberate steps. At the burial site, the Archbishop spoke of Albert's courage, his humility, his refusal to rule from behind palace walls. He called him the king who stood with his people until his last breath, a line that drew muffled sobs from the crowd. But outside the formal speeches, there was another layer of meaning. For some in attendance, the mystery of his death lingered even here, in the solemn quiet of consecrated ground. They wondered if the man they mourned had met his fate by accident, or if the truth was lying as deep as his coffin would soon be. No one voiced these thoughts aloud, but they moved like a shadow through the crowd, an unspoken counterpoint to the Archbishop's words. As the casket was lowered, Queen Elizabeth stepped forward and placed a single sprig of rosemary on the lid, a symbol of remembrance. The ropes creaked as the coffin descended, and the sound of earth striking wood echoed in the winter air. It was the final punctuation to a reign that had carried Belgium through its gravest trial, and yet ended on a cliff where no one could swear to have seen the last moment. When the crowd finally began to disperse, the bells rang again, not in mourning this time, but in proclamation. Belgium had a new king. The transition was official. The chapter closed. Yet for those who had walked behind the casket that day, the image of Albert's funeral procession, its measured steps, its silent faces, its trail of crushed white flowers, would remain fixed in memory, as much a part of his legacy as any battlefield or treaty. In the weeks after the funeral, the streets of Brussels returned to the rhythms of ordinary life. Shopkeepers sweeping the dust from their doorways, streetcars rattling past the same cafes, children playing marbles in the same narrow alleys. And yet, something in the air had changed. The absence of Albert there was not simply political. It was a shift in the very image Belgium held of itself. His death had been wrapped in an air of mystery, his life steeped in courage, and together they began to form the outline of a national legend. Newspapers, sensing the public's appetite for a figure larger than mortality, began to print stories of the king who never feared death. Articles recounted in rich detail his wartime visits to the front, how he had stood on the Yser plain with shells bursting nearby, how he had refused to wear a helmet because his soldiers had none. Some of these accounts were true, others embellished, but in the retelling they blurred into something more potent than fact. They became symbol. Photographs from earlier years resurfaced. Albert in military uniform, Albert shaking the hands of coal miners, Albert striding ahead of his entourage on alpine climbs. These images were reprinted so often that they began to outshine the man himself, replacing memory with iconography. School children learned his name alongside those of medieval kings and ancient heroes, his wartime leadership folded neatly into the national narrative of resistance and unity. The Catholic Church, too, embraced his image. Sermons spoke of Albert's devotion to his people, his moral integrity, his humble faith. Priests drew parallels between his sacrifice and the virtues of saints, framing his death as the inevitable end of a life lived in service to others. In a country still divided between linguistic, political, and class lines, this framing offered something rare: a unifying figure who belonged to no faction more than another. Yet myths are rarely built from praise alone. The unanswered questions about his death began to act as fuel for the story rather than a blemish. In taverns and on factory floors, people whispered theories, some claiming he had been meeting someone in secret, others that foul play had been involved. The absence of witnesses became a canvas on which rumor could paint freely. And each telling added a new stroke to the portrait of a king whose end was as enigmatic as his courage was clear. Books followed. Memoirs of soldiers who had served under him, accounts by palace staff, even speculative novels that placed Albert in imagined scenes during his final hours. In the popular imagination, he became the kind of figure who could not simply die from an ordinary fall. There had to be more, something untold, perhaps something deliberately hidden. Commemorations sprang up across the country. Streets and schools were renamed in his honor. Plaques were mounted on walls, statues commissioned. In Liège, a bronze figure of Albert was cast astride a horse, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though still leading his army into battle. In Antwerp, a marble bust stood in the city hall, his features smoothed into the timeless calm of classical sculpture. These monuments, set in stone and metal, served not only to honor his reign, but to anchor his image in the physical landscape of Belgium, making it impossible to walk through certain squares or avenues without encountering the silent presence of the king. The mountainside at Marche-les-Dames, once known mainly to local climbers, became a site of quiet pilgrimage. People would leave flowers at the base of the cliff, tracing the path they imagined Albert had taken on that final day. Some came in search of understanding, others simply to stand where history had shifted. The place took on an aura, part memorial, part mystery, that made it more than a geographic point on a map. It became a chapter of the national story, one written in stone and silence. As years passed, the historical Albert and the mythical Albert began to separate. The man who had worried over budgets, who had argued with ministers, who had wrestled with the compromises of politics, faded into the background. In his place stood the eternal Night King, the ruler who shared the mud of the trenches, who climbed mountains with the same ease as he commanded armies, who died in a way that left the final page of his story stubbornly blank. In a way, this transformation was inevitable. Nations need their myths as much as they need their constitutions. Myths can unite people across divides, give them a shared language of pride, endurance, and loss. And in a Belgium still marked by the scars of occupation and the fault lines of identity, Albert first provided that common ground. Even those who had opposed some of his decisions found themselves drawn into the narrative. Political enemies softened their critiques. Old controversies grew quieter. It is difficult to argue against a man once he has been cast in bronze and placed in the center of a city square, his hand forever outstretched in greeting to the people. By the time a decade had passed, Albert's story was no longer merely a royal biography. It had become a national fable. And like all fables, it carried both truth and invention, both clarity and shadow. The king who had lived among his soldiers now lived among his people in another way, as a figure whose face was known, whose deeds were celebrated, and whose final moments could never be entirely claimed by history. The man was gone. The myth was just beginning. Decades after that February afternoon in 1934, the death of King Albert I still sits in a strange place between record and rumor, between the official explanation and the unanswered questions that stubbornly refuse to fade. For every neat summary in a school textbook, there is a historian, an archivist, or a curious amateur ready to point out the loose threads in the narrative. The official story is simple enough. Albert, an avid mountaineer, was climbing at Marche-les-Dames alone when he slipped, struck his head, and fell to his death. His body was discovered later at the base of the cliff, and the coroner's report matched a fatal head injury consistent with a fall. It was the kind of tragedy that seemed plausible on its surface. After all, the king had a known passion for climbing and an aversion to bodyguards on such outings. But history rarely sits quietly with the plausible. Some point first to the issue of timing. Witness accounts disagree on exactly when Albert left the palace and when his absence was noticed. The gap between those times creates a sliver of uncertainty, one wide enough for conspiracy theories to step into. If the king had been seen elsewhere that day, or had met with someone unrecorded, it would not show in the tidy official account. Then there is the matter of his body's discovery. The first person to find him was not a royal guard, but a local man, a climber who claimed he stumbled upon the king by accident. His testimony, though recorded, leaves room for speculation. Was the position of the body consistent with a fall from the route Albert was said to be climbing? Some argue no, suggesting the body might have been moved. Others counter that in mountainous terrain, the path of a falling body can be unpredictable. There are even whispers, never proven, that Albert's death could have been linked to politics. In the years before his passing, he had taken positions that irritated certain factions, particularly in the volatile climate of post-World War I Europe. His cautious diplomacy with France and his firm stance on Belgian neutrality had not pleased every power broker. Could an accident have been more than an accident? Historians tread carefully here, for the evidence is scant and circumstantial. Yet the idea persists, if only because mystery invites it. Another theory floats in the murkier waters of personal life. Albert was known to take solitary excursions, sometimes without explanation. Some suggest he may have been meeting someone privately that day, perhaps a confidant, perhaps a woman. If true, such a meeting would have been shielded from the public record, and any accident occurring during it would require a carefully managed story to protect reputations. But again, this remains in the realm of suggestion, not proof. Forensic details, too, have been a battleground for interpretation. The autopsy described a head injury severe enough to cause instant death. But some researchers point out that bruising patterns were never made public in detail, leaving open the question of whether the blow came solely from a fall. Over the decades, calls for exhumation to re-examine the remains have been raised. But the royal family has resisted, preferring the dignity of closure to the spectacle of reopened wounds. Even the location itself, the cliffs of Marche-les-Dames, feeds the uncertainty. Albert had climbed there before, but friends claimed he considered that day's weather unsuitable for a solo ascent. Why choose that place and time? Was it a last-minute decision, or part of a plan unrelated to climbing at all? No diary entry, no letter, no confirmed conversation has surfaced to answer that. Modern historians fall into two broad camps. The first accepts the official account as the most probable, pointing out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that none has emerged in almost a century. The second sees the unanswered questions not as proof of conspiracy, but as indicators that the story is incomplete, missing details that could alter our understanding of the king's final hours. Public opinion mirrors this split. Polls taken on anniversaries of his death show Belgians evenly divided between those who believe the accident explanation and those who suspect something more. In cafes and family kitchens, the debate can still flare up, with older generations passing along half-remembered anecdotes as though they were pieces of classified intelligence. The archives, for their part, have not fully settled the matter. Some royal correspondence from the weeks surrounding Albert's death remains inaccessible, protected by privacy restrictions. While such sealing is not unusual for state figures, it inevitably stirs suspicion among those inclined to read secrecy as guilt. Perhaps this is why Albert's death endures as a subject of fascination. It occupies that uncomfortable space where facts stop short and silence takes over. The historian's instinct is to push into that silence, to demand more evidence, more records, more testimonies. But sometimes, silence is all that remains. And in that silence, the story becomes less about what happened and more about what we choose to believe. The king who once strode through the mud of the Isère now stands at the edge of history's fog, his final moments visible only as a silhouette. The distance between accident and assassination, between truth and legend, is measured not in meters or minutes, but in the stubborn human desire to make sense of loss. And as the years pass, that desire ensures one thing: Albert will never entirely leave the realm of mystery. In the end, the death of King Albert I remains a riddle that refuses to be solved. The official records tell one story: a monarch who loved the mountains lost his footing, his life ending in the very solitude he sought. Yet the shadows around that afternoon, misaligned timelines, unanswered questions, sealed documents, invite a second story, one that will never be confirmed but will always be whispered. Perhaps that is why his legacy endures beyond marble statues and history books. Albert was the soldier king, the monarch who stood in the trenches with his troops during World War I, who refused exile, who embodied the rare fusion of crown and courage. In life, he was a figure who bridged distance between ruler and people, between battlefield and palace. In death, he became something more elusive, a symbol of how even the strongest can vanish into mystery. We might never know if the snow-covered rocks at Marche-les-Dames were the only witnesses to his final moments, or if unseen hands shaped the end of his story. What we do know is that Albert lived by principles that defied convenience, and sometimes, perhaps, those principles placed him in quiet opposition to powerful interests. That truth alone makes his passing a matter of enduring fascination. History is often written in ink, but some pages seem written in frost. Fragile, temporary, melting before they can be read in full. Albert's last climb is one of those pages. We stand before it as readers, filling the gaps with our own interpretations, knowing that the definitive version has been locked away by time itself. And so, the cliffs remain. The snow falls. The questions linger. In this video, we have walked alongside Albert I from his unexpected rise to his lonely death, peeling back layers of official narrative and rumor alike. Whether you believe it was an accident, a meeting gone wrong, or something darker, one thing is certain: the story of the king who fell where no one saw is not one history will ever close. If you found this journey into the past as compelling as we did, consider subscribing to Dark Ages Unveiled, where we uncover the hidden tragedies, unanswered questions, and forgotten lives that shaped our world. There are always more shadows to explore.